In the spring of 1945, as the Pacific War neared its final convulsion, the island of Okinawa stood as Japan's last bastion before the home islands. To the Imperial General Staff, it was the keystone of defense, a natural fortress that would slow the advancing Americans and, in doing so, buy time for the homeland to prepare for what all believed to be the inevitable invasion. To the young men and boys conscripted from its villages and schools, it was simply home, a place of limestone ridges, coral fields, and the whispering of the Pacific wind that had once promised peace. The mobilization had begun months earlier, long before the first naval shells fell. In the prefectural schools, teachers stood before classrooms filled with boys barely old enough to shave and instructed them in the art of defense. These were the student corps, hastily assembled, poorly armed, and told that their sacrifice would defend the emperor's realm. They were 15, 16, 17, old enough to believe in honor, too young to understand death as a certainty. For the Imperial Japanese Army's 32nd Army, commanded by General Mitsuru Ushijima, Okinawa's geography offered both salvation and doom. Beneath the ridges and coral hills stretched a labyrinth of caves, tunnels, and bunkers, the ideal terrain for a prolonged defense. There, engineers and soldiers worked by candlelight, carving rooms for ammunition, rations, and field hospitals. They wrote letters home by the flicker of oil lamps, concealing their fear beneath stoic lines of loyalty and endurance. To the south, beyond the Ryukyuan chain, the sea churned with the machinery of an empire in decline. American task forces, now masters of the Pacific, assembled an invasion force of unprecedented scale when 300 ships, 180,000 men, and an armada of steel that blotted the horizon. For the United States, Okinawa was not merely a stepping stone, it was the rehearsal for the invasion of Japan itself. Operation Iceberg, as it was called, aimed to capture the island and transform it into a forward base for the final assault. By late March, the sky above Okinawa had become a battleground. Waves of American aircraft, fighters, bombers, torpedo planes, swept in from carriers to pound the coastal defenses. On the ground, civilians dug trenches and shelters. Buddhist temples became command posts. Schoolyards became artillery emplacements. The sound of shovels and distant explosions blended into a single continuous rhythm, the sound of a society bracing for annihilation. Among those conscripted were the boys of the Blood and Iron Student Corps, drawn from local schools such as the Okinawa Normal School and the Prefectural Girls' High School. The boys were issued antiquated rifles, sometimes even bamboo spears. The girls were sent to serve as nurses in the underground hospitals, where the wounded and dying would later pile in the hundreds. Many had never seen a gun before. They were instructed to memorize the proper method of fixing bayonets, of thrusting at the abdomen, of shouting, "Tenno Heika Banzai," before charging into death. April 1st, 1945, L-Day. The largest amphibious assault in the Pacific War began under a sun veiled by the haze of bombardment. The beaches of Hagushi were shrouded in smoke, and the sea boiled with landing craft. Yet, to the surprise of the Marines and soldiers who stormed ashore, resistance was minimal. The defenders had withdrawn into the island's interior, into the hills and caves that would soon become the crucible of Okinawa's agony. As the American divisions, the 1st and 6th Marine Divisions, the 7th and 96th Infantry, fanned out from the beaches, they found only scattered mines, abandoned trenches, and the occasional sniper. The land seemed eerily empty. Civilians hid in caves. The student soldiers waited in silence, deep underground, clutching their rifles and listening to the thunder above. They were told that the enemy would show no mercy, that capture meant torture, mutilation, and dishonor beyond comprehension. To surrender was not an option. To die was duty fulfilled. The Americans advanced cautiously, their memories haunted by the slaughter at Peleliu and Iwo Jima. They knew the Japanese were near, watching, waiting. The flat northern plains fell quickly, but the southern ridges held the true battle to come. The ridgelines, Shuri, Sugarloaf, Kakuzu, Maeda, each would become synonymous with slaughter. And in the tunnels beneath them, the teenage soldiers of Okinawa waited, unaware that history had already chosen them as witnesses to a war beyond human endurance. The rains came, turning the coral soil into viscous mud that swallowed boots and dragged down vehicles. The dead, Japanese, American, and civilian, lay unburied, their bodies swelling in the humid air. The Marines moved forward inch by inch, fighting not only men, but a landscape transformed into fortress. Flamethrowers and satchel charges turned caves into infernos. The Japanese counterattacked with suicidal determination, emerging from tunnels under cover of night, striking with grenades and bayonets, and vanishing again into the earth. For the teenage conscripts, these moments blurred into an unending sequence of terror. They carried ammunition to frontline units, retrieved wounded officers, and sometimes served as human messengers across the shattered terrain. Some never made it back. Others vanished into the smoke, their names lost in the chaos of command. Many believed even then that they were defending the emperor himself, that their island stood as the final wall between him and the invading barbarians. From the sky, American aircraft strafed and bombed without pause. The smell of cordite, burned flesh, and tropical decay hung over the island. Civilians wandered between the lines, clutching infants or leading oxen laden with what little they could carry. The Americans, hardened by years of combat, were unprepared for the sight of children among the enemy. Yet, to the Japanese soldiers, every civilian was a potential spy, every child a possible sacrifice in the nation's last stand. By mid-April, the full measure of Okinawa's nightmare had begun to unfold. By mid-April 1945, the American advance had met its first real wall of resistance, the Shuri Line. Stretching across the southern third of Okinawa, it was not a line in the conventional sense, but a vast defensive labyrinth of ridges, caves, and interlocking fields of fire. Conceived by General Ushijima and his chief of staff, General Cho, it was designed to bleed the invaders, forcing them into attrition that no spirit of modern warfare could easily endure. The rains did not stop. Each day, gray clouds hung low, and the battlefield became a swamp of mud and blood. Tanks stalled in coral craters, and artillery pieces sank up to their axles. The soldiers, on both sides, lived in filth and constant peril. The Marines called it the worst ground we ever fought on. The Japanese called it the crucible of the emperor. The teenage soldiers who manned the periphery of this defense had already been transformed from students into shadows of men. Their world was the darkness of limestone caverns. They slept on damp rock, subsisted on handfuls of rice, and listened to the thunder of American naval guns echo through the underground chambers. Some wrote in notebooks they could barely keep dry, fragments of farewell messages to families they would never see again. Others simply sat in silence, hollow-eyed, as officers recited the imperial rescript and urged them to prepare for honorable death. For the Americans, progress was measured not in miles but in yards. The 1st Marine Division assaulted Kakazu Ridge, where Japanese machine guns raked the slopes in intersecting arcs of fire. The 96th Infantry suffered thousands of casualties in a matter of days. Each hill captured by day was often lost again by night. Japanese artillery, hidden in cave mouths, opened fire after dusk, An American counter-battery fire turned the ridges into infernos. There was no respite, only the monotonous rhythm of slaughter. In the midst of this, the Americans encountered something that disturbed even the most battle-hardened veterans. The bodies they found after engagements were often those of adolescents, boys wearing school uniforms beneath tattered tunics, their helmets too large for their heads. Some still carried student notebooks or slings fashioned from school sashes. The realization spread slowly through the ranks. Japan was sending its children to die. Military intelligence had warned of such mobilizations, but few had believed them to be more than rumor. Now, as Marines advanced into captured tunnels, they found crude bunks lined with school textbooks and chalk-written slogans on the walls. Protect the Emperor, destroy the invaders, loyalty until death. The discovery left many silent. Some turned away, unwilling to speak of it. Others grew only more resolute, interpreting it as proof of the fanaticism they had been told to expect. Meanwhile, the Japanese command faced its own internal collapse. Supplies dwindled. The once carefully planned defense began to fragment as communication lines were cut and American flamethrowers turned tunnel systems into tombs. The Okinawan civilians, caught in the middle, faced starvation and disease. Thousands fled southward, seeking shelter in the same caves that housed the soldiers. Mothers tried to quiet their infants as battles raged outside, terrified that a cry would bring fire. On the 18th of April, American artillery concentrated on the village of Maida, reducing it to rubble. In the ruins, teenage soldiers from the Blood and Iron Corps held their ground, firing obsolete rifles until the last ammunition was spent. When the Marines finally took the position, they found bodies piled in trenches, some clutching grenades that had failed to detonate. A few survivors, dazed and half-deafened, were dragged from the rubble. They expected immediate execution. Instead, the Americans gave them water. Elsewhere along the line, similar scenes unfolded. Moments of contact between two armies separated not only by language and ideology, but by their understanding of mercy. The Marines were trained to fight to the last enemy, yet they found themselves confronting opponents who refused to surrender even when unarmed. The Japanese soldiers, taught that capture was a disgrace worse than death, sometimes begged to be killed. The Americans often obliged, not out of cruelty, but out of confusion and fear. Yet, in rare instances, mercy prevailed, and it was in those moments that the seeds of disbelief were planted among the teenage defenders. The Shuri Line held for nearly 2 months. Every cave and ridge became a name on the map of human endurance: Half Moon Hill, Sugarloaf, Wanna Draw, Dakeshi. The cost was staggering. American casualties surpassed those of any previous Pacific battle. Japanese losses were incalculable. The civilians suffered worst of all, trapped between the two armies, dying in numbers that could never be precisely recorded. By May, the Shuri defenses began to crumble. The Imperial headquarters, once hidden in a vast cave near Shuri Castle, came under direct bombardment. Ushijima's staff debated whether to retreat or die in place. General Cho, the fiery nationalist, urged a final counterattack, an all-out charge to annihilate the enemy and achieve a death worthy of the samurai. Ushijima, more pragmatic, understood the futility, but even he could not defy the ethos that had shaped the army's code. Orders went out for every available soldier, including students, to prepare for the final battle. In those days, the teenage soldiers became ghosts, moving through rain and smoke. They carried stretchers through minefields, crawled under fire to deliver messages, and dug graves for fallen comrades whose names they barely knew. Many no longer spoke. The rhetoric of honor had been replaced by exhaustion. They watched as officers performed ritual suicides with grenades clutched to their chests, the explosions echoing like punctuation marks at the end of a vanishing world. The Marines advanced steadily, their progress measured by the shattered remains of once peaceful villages. They called in artillery and airstrikes with mechanical precision, reducing each ridge to rubble before moving forward. Behind them, the landscape of Okinawa was transformed into a wasteland, trees stripped bare, fields cratered, rivers clogged with debris and corpses. War had erased the island's past and replaced it with a geography of ruin. On May 29th, American forces entered the ruins of Shuri Castle. The ancient symbol of Ryukyuan culture, it had stood for centuries as a monument to local heritage. Now it lay in ashes. For the Japanese soldiers watching from the south, the fall of Shuri was both a tactical and spiritual defeat. For the Americans, it was a signal that victory was near, though few could yet grasp the price that victory would exact. The surviving teenage soldiers retreated further south into the narrow peninsula around Mabuni. There, in the final weeks of June, they would witness the disintegration of the army itself. The officers' discipline dissolved. Ammunition was nearly gone. Rations consisted of a few grains of rice, a strip of seaweed, or nothing at all. Yet even then, the propaganda continued. Leaflets and loudspeakers proclaiming that the emperor watched their valor, that surrender meant eternal shame. To the Americans it seemed madness, an enemy that refused to yield even when annihilation was certain. But to the boys in tattered uniforms, it was the only truth they had ever been allowed to believe. By early June 1945, the battle for Okinawa had become a struggle no longer defined by strategy but by endurance. The Shuri Line had ceased to exist. What remained of the Japanese 32nd Army was a scattering of isolated units, small groups of soldiers, often led by non-commissioned officers or teachers-turned-commanders, retreating through the rain-soaked hills toward the southern cliffs. The island, once green and fertile, had been reduced to a panorama of ash and mud. The Americans pressed on with mechanical inevitability. The 6th Marine Division advanced along the western coast, the 7th and 96th Infantry Divisions along the east. Between them, the remnants of the Imperial Army disintegrated into a maze of caves, ravines, and shattered villages. The Marines called it the mop-up, but the term belied the horror of what they encountered. Each cave was a potential fortress, each mound of coral a grave. When they entered, they found not organized resistance, but the detritus of a destroyed nation. Bodies in student uniforms, fragments of family photographs, and hastily written prayers for forgiveness. The teenage soldiers, now leaderless, tried to follow the last standing officers southward. Their weapons were often useless, their ammunition spent. Some carried wooden rifles for training, others nothing at all. They moved mostly at night, guided by rumor and instinct. In the caves near Itamen, groups of boys huddled together, clutching grenades they were told to use when capture became unavoidable. Many had not eaten in days. Fever and infection spread. The younger ones wept silently, too afraid to speak above the roar of bombardment. To the north, American artillery pounded the ridges relentlessly. Navy guns offshore joined the barrage, and each salvo rolled across the island like thunder. The Japanese positions vanished one by one, erased from the landscape. A few units attempted counterattacks, but they were crushed within hours. Communications with headquarters were lost entirely. Even General Ushijima's staff no longer knew where the remnants of their divisions were. The chain of command had dissolved into the smoke. Among the Americans, exhaustion was universal. They fought through terrain that offered no cover but endless danger. The mud swallowed equipment, and the stench of death was omnipresent. Corpsmen moved from foxhole to foxhole, administering morphine to the wounded and marking the dead. Rain fell continuously, mixing with blood and diesel oil. Letters from home arrived soaked and unreadable. The Marines and soldiers alike began to understand that this island, promised as a stepping stone to victory, had become a kind of living tomb. When the first Japanese prisoners appeared, they were scarcely recognizable as soldiers. Most were boys, gaunt, barefoot, trembling with fever. They emerged from caves waving white cloths, their eyes wide with terror. Many had expected to be shot on sight. They had been told that Americans killed all prisoners. Instead, they were surrounded, disarmed, and given water. The Marines, though hardened by years of battle, found themselves confused by the sight of such youth. They were younger than their own brothers back home. Reports filtered through American lines describing these encounters. Intelligence officers noted the presence of school insignias on the uniforms, student notebooks, even exam papers carried in satchels. Some Marines collected these items out of curiosity, others as grim souvenirs. One company commander wrote in his field diary, "They are children, scared, starved children, no words for it." Yet, even as compassion stirred, the violence did not abate. There were still caves where fanatics fought to the last, and any hesitation meant death. In the southern villages of Mabuni and Hill 89, the final Japanese positions held on. Ushijima had retreated there with his staff, establishing a temporary command post in a cave overlooking the sea. The order had been issued: each soldier shall die with honor. For many, that meant suicide. Officers lined their remaining troops, read them the Emperor's message, and distributed grenades. Some soldiers gathered in circles, pulling pins together. Others ran toward the enemy lines, shouting until machine gun fire cut them down. The sound of explosions and gunfire mingled with the crash of waves below the cliffs. Yet not all obeyed. Among the teenage conscripts, the instinct for survival began to outweigh the indoctrination of death. They had seen too much, endured too long. When the grenades failed to detonate or the will to die faltered, they crawled from their caves and surrendered, hesitant, trembling, expecting the gunshot that never came. The Marines, astonished, took them in quietly, offering rations and cigarettes. Some of the boys refused food, believing it to be poisoned. Others wept openly when given water. It was the first act of mercy many had ever witnessed. By June 20th, organized resistance on Okinawa had effectively ended. General Ushijima and General Cho, having accepted the hopelessness of their cause, prepared for death in accordance with samurai tradition. Before dawn on June 22nd, they performed seppuku in the cave near Hill 89, their aides following suit. Their bodies were found later by American patrols, an ending that seemed to confirm the cultural gulf that had defined the entire war. In the aftermath, the Marines combed through the shattered terrain, clearing caves and tending to the wounded. They found thousands of civilians, some hiding among corpses, others too weak to move. Many still believed the Americans would kill them. Leaflets and loudspeakers were used to urge surrender, to promise safety. Gradually, the refugees emerged, families, farmers, widows, and children who had lost everything. The Marines set up aid stations, distributing food and medical care, though disease spread faster than relief could arrive. Among the rescued were clusters of teenage soldiers who had managed to survive. Some were captured unconscious from starvation, others surrendered willingly, unable to bear the silence of the dead any longer. They were taken to temporary camps near the beaches where doctors examined them and interrogators asked questions in slow, broken Japanese. The boys answered mechanically, their faces blank. They did not understand why they were still alive. For the Americans, the victory was complete but hollow. Over 12,000 of their own were dead, 36,000 wounded. For the Japanese, the losses were catastrophic, more than 100,000 soldiers and at least as many civilians. The island that had once been a paradise of coral and sugarcane was now a wasteland of bones. The Marines who looked out over the cliffs of Mabuni saw not triumph, but a vision of what an invasion of Japan might bring. Few spoke of glory any more. In the captured caves, war correspondents began to document the remnants of the student corps. They photographed the chalked slogans, the school books, the makeshift shrines. The images shocked audiences back home. They revealed a truth that propaganda on neither side had fully admitted, that the war had consumed not only soldiers, but an entire generation of youth. For the Japanese boys who survived, survival itself became a burden, proof that they had failed in their duty. They sat in silence in the prisoner enclosures, watching the American sentries move among them. Some waited for execution that never came. Others simply stared at the sea, unable to reconcile mercy with the teachings that had shaped their lives. When rations were handed out, they hesitated before eating. When spoken to, they lowered their eyes. Their disbelief was not joy. It was confusion so deep that it felt like shame. The battle for Okinawa was over, yet in the hearts of those who lived through it, Marine and Japanese alike, it would never truly end. In late June 1945, Okinawa ceased to be a battlefield and became a graveyard. The guns fell silent, but the silence itself felt unnatural, a vast emptiness that stretched across hills once alive with thunder. Smoke drifted over the ruins of Naha, where an entire city had been reduced to blackened stone. The air smelled of ash, salt, and decay. The island had absorbed so much death that even the wind seemed heavy with it. The U.S. 10th Army began its work of consolidation. Engineers cleared the roads, bulldozers buried the dead in mass graves, and medics set up field hospitals for tens of thousands of wounded and starving civilians. Okinawa, once home to a population of over 300,000, was now an open wound. The few buildings still standing were converted into aid centers and command posts. The Marines who had survived months of combat found themselves in a landscape of ruin, their discipline intact, but their spirits numbed. Among the first orders issued by American command was the humane treatment of prisoners and civilians. Leaflets in Japanese were distributed throughout the island, promises of food, water, and safety. Loudspeakers repeated the same message, their calm voices drifting over the cliffs where, only days earlier, entire families had leapt to their deaths rather than face capture. The sound of the broadcasts carried through the shattered valleys, urging those who remained in hiding to come out. Slowly they did. Women carrying children, old men leaning on bamboo sticks, and boys in ragged uniforms emerged from caves. Some raised their hands in surrender, others simply collapsed. The Marines and soldiers, who had expected ambushes, now found themselves distributing rations instead of grenades. They set up feeding stations using discarded ammunition boxes as tables. Water was drawn from wells and filtered through makeshift canvas. The contrast between the destruction and these small acts of mercy was stark and disorienting. The teenage soldiers of the Student Corps were gathered into separate compounds near the coastal plains. Military intelligence officers, assisted by interpreters from Nisei units, questioned them about their units and training. Most of the boys could offer little detail. Many did not know the names of their commanding officers. They had been drafted by teachers, not soldiers. Their answers were hesitant, often interrupted by tears. They spoke of hunger, fear, and confusion more than strategy. The interrogators, accustomed to dealing with fanatics, began to realize they were interviewing children. In one enclosure, a Marine lieutenant noted the prisoner's age in his report. Estimated 15 to 17, dressed in remnants of school uniforms, no shoes, malnourished, display signs of trauma and exhaustion. He wrote of their disbelief at being spared, their refusal to meet his eyes. When offered food, they bowed repeatedly before eating. When told they would be safe, they responded with silence. The cultural gulf was immense, but the human distance was smaller than anyone had expected. For the Marines, who had fought through the caves and trenches of southern Okinawa, this aftermath was a strange inversion of war. Many had lost comrades in brutal combat, had seen friends burned alive or dismembered by hidden explosives. They had been taught to expect treachery in every surrender. Now, faced with starving teenagers and weeping civilians, they felt emotions they could not easily name: pity, guilt, even anger at the futility of what they had endured. They had come expecting to fight men. Instead, they had fought a nation's children. American chaplains moved among the camps, distributing supplies and speaking softly through interpreters. Medical teams treated wounds, dysentery, and malaria. Photographers recorded everything: the emaciated faces, the burned villages, the burial details. The images would later appear in magazines and military archives, shaping how the world would remember the battle. But no photograph could capture the stillness that settled over the island once the shooting stopped. A stillness filled with the weight of what could no longer be undone. In the ruins of Naha, the Marines found the remains of schools converted into makeshift barracks. On the walls, slogans still clung in faded paint. Die for the Emperor. 100 million glorious deaths. The irony was unbearable. Beneath these words lay the corpses of boys who had taken them literally. In some classrooms, bullet holes marked the blackboards. In others, desks were stacked into barricades. The smell of chalk and gunpowder mingled, the symbols of education and destruction fused together into one. For the surviving students, captivity became an existence between worlds. They were neither soldiers nor civilians, too young to die, yet too broken to return to childhood. Many could not comprehend that the Americans had spared them. They had expected humiliation or execution. Instead, they were given blankets and medicine. The Marines treated their wounds and offered cigarettes they did not know how to smoke. The disbelief that filled their eyes was not relief, but confusion. A wordless question about why they were still alive when their friends were not. Some of the boys began to write again. On scraps of paper scavenged from ration boxes, they composed notes to families they assumed were dead. Others copied passages from the imperial rescript they had memorized, unable to let go of the beliefs that had shaped them. A few, when asked what they would do after the war, said only that they wished to atone by working the fields or tending graves. They had no concept of victory or defeat, only of survival as an inexplicable condition. American officers debated what to do with the prisoners. Many were transferred to temporary holding areas where they were fed and gradually reintegrated into civilian life. The younger ones were eventually released to aid stations run by Okinawan elders. The Marines who guarded them often spoke of how quietly they behaved, how they lined up, bowed, and accepted orders without protest. It was as if obedience had outlasted ideology. Meanwhile, in the broader world, the battle's aftermath reverberated far beyond the island. Reports reached Washington describing the ferocity of Japanese resistance and the staggering civilian toll. Military planners read them with grim focus, understanding what such a defense would mean if repeated on the Japanese mainland. Okinawa had cost the United States more lives than any previous Pacific engagement. If this was a preview of an invasion of Japan itself, the casualties would be unimaginable. For the Japanese High Command, the fall of Okinawa was the final confirmation that the empire stood on the edge of destruction. Communication with the island had ceased. No reinforcements would come. Yet propaganda on the home front continued, extolling the noble deaths of the Okinawan defenders. The reality, starving children, civilian suicides, boys bewildered by mercy, never reached the population. The story of Okinawa became both a myth and a silence. As the occupation settled into routine, the Americans began rebuilding what little infrastructure remained. Roads were cleared, wells restored, makeshift housing erected. The survivors worked under supervision, clearing debris and recovering bodies. The teenage prisoners were sometimes assigned to help bury the dead. They did so without complaint, their faces expressionless. They buried their friends and teachers alongside strangers, each grave marked only by a bamboo cross. Some whispered prayers, others said nothing at all. The Marines, watching them work, felt a quiet unease. They had come to see the Japanese as relentless and inhuman. Now, standing beside these frail boys, they recognized something painfully familiar. The war had blurred every distinction between soldier and civilian, adult and child, duty and tragedy. It was a realization that settled into their memories and would not leave, even years later when peace returned and the island was forgotten by the world. By late summer, the camps began to empty. The surviving students were released to what remained of their families or to makeshift orphanages established by American relief teams. They left behind the enclosures quietly, bowing to the sentries who had once been their enemies. Some carried small bundles of belongings, a piece of cloth, a canteen, a notebook. They walked north toward ruined villages and fields that no longer grew anything. The war was over, but the meaning of mercy still eluded them. When the war ended in August 1945, the news reached Okinawa not with celebration but with disbelief. There were no flags, no parades, no spontaneous shouts of joy, only the sound of rain falling over a landscape still filled with the dead. Word spread slowly through the camps and ruins. Japan had surrendered. The Emperor had spoken on the radio, his voice broadcast for the first time to his subjects. The surviving teenage soldiers, those who had once sworn to die for him, listened in silence. They did not understand every word, but they understood the tone. The divine had become human. For them, the surrender brought no relief. It stripped their suffering of purpose. Everything they had been told, that the Emperor was a god, that death was purity, that Americans were demons, dissolved in an instant. The dissonance was unbearable. Some wept, not for defeat, but for the emptiness that followed it. Others turned away, unwilling to face a world in which mercy had replaced martyrdom. The Americans, too, felt the weight of that moment. The Marines who had fought from the beaches of Hagushi to the cliffs of Mabuni now looked upon their former enemies with a new perspective. The atomic bombs had fallen on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the war they had fought so fiercely was suddenly over. There would be no invasion of the Japanese mainland, no repetition of Okinawa's carnage. For many, it was a relief tempered by guilt, an awareness that their victory had come at an immeasurable cost. Okinawa became a logistical hub for the occupation of Japan. Airfields were expanded, barracks built, roads paved over ground still rich with bones. The island was now a base, a forward outpost of a new world order. Yet beneath the surface of military efficiency lingered memories that no order could erase. The locals returned to their villages, or what was left of them, and began the slow work of rebuilding. Fields once littered with shrapnel were cleared by hand. Schoolhouses were reconstructed from scrap wood. Children played among the ruins, their laughter echoing through valleys that had once resounded with artillery. The surviving student soldiers, now free, found themselves adrift in a society that no longer recognized them. Many returned to find their families gone. Others were ostracized for their association with the imperial army. They had been heroes once, then martyrs in waiting. Now they were reminders of a madness the nation wished to forget. Some never spoke of the war again. Others recorded their experiences years later, when the silence became too heavy to bear. Their memoirs, written in plain language, revealed not bitterness but confusion, the enduring question of why they had been spared when so many had not. Among them were boys who would later become teachers, farmers, and clerks. They built lives of quiet perseverance, carrying within them the memory of that first moment of mercy, the American soldier offering water, the unexpected voice that said, "You will live." For decades, they struggled to reconcile that act with everything they had been taught. Their disbelief never faded, it transformed into reflection. In later years, when interviewed by historians, some said that the moment of surrender was also the moment they began to doubt everything they had believed about war and honor. For the Americans who had fought on Okinawa, the memories were equally indelible. They returned home to a country that celebrated victory but could not imagine the battle's horror. Many spoke little of what they had seen. When they did, it was often not of triumph, but of the faces of the enemy, the children in uniform, the caves filled with civilians, the gestures of surrender that came too late. Some admitted that the sight of mercy had haunted them more than the violence. To spare a child after killing so many adults was a moral contradiction they could not easily resolve. In time, Okinawa itself became a living memorial. The island remained under American administration for decades after the war, its airfields and bases reminders of the conflict's enduring consequences. Yet the people rebuilt with quiet resilience. Temples were restored, crops replanted, schools reopened. The landscape healed slowly, though scars remained, not only in the earth, but in the collective memory of those who had survived its transformation from paradise to hell. On the southern cliffs of Mabuni, where the final battles had raged, memorials began to rise. One for the Japanese soldiers, one for the Okinawan civilians, one for the Americans who had fallen. Later, they would be joined by monuments bearing the names of students, boys and girls who had died believing they were defending a divine nation. Their classmates, the few who had lived, visited these sites in silence, laying flowers and bowing deeply. The sea below, once red with blood, now shimmered with sunlight. The wind that had carried the roar of artillery now carried only the sound of waves. The story of the teenage soldiers and the Marines who spared them became part of Okinawa's post-war identity. It appeared in local histories, in museum exhibits, in testimonies collected by peace movements. Yet, even as it entered the public record, it retained an air of disbelief, as if the mercy shown on that devastated island defied the logic of war itself. The boys who had survived did not see themselves as lucky. They saw themselves as living contradictions. To be spared, they said, was to carry the burden of memory for those who had fulfilled their orders to die. In American memory, Okinawa came to represent the threshold of the unimaginable. It was the battle that convinced military planners that an invasion of Japan would bring catastrophe. It was also the battle that revealed the humanity of the enemy in its most tragic form. Veterans who returned to Okinawa years later as tourists or in reconciliation ceremonies often spoke of the silence, how the island seemed to breathe differently, as if aware of what it had endured. Some found the caves where they had fought now overgrown with moss. Others met with former student soldiers, men now in their 80s, who bowed deeply before shaking hands. In those gestures, decades of distance collapsed. For the survivors, memory became a form of duty. Each year, on the anniversary of the battle's end, they gathered at the Peace Memorial Park overlooking the cliffs of Mabuni. They recited the names of the dead, Japanese, Okinawan, American, without distinction. School children placed garlands at the monuments, and the wind carried their voices across the sea. The surviving students, now old men, watched quietly. Some still spoke little. Others gave brief addresses to the younger generation, urging them to remember not the glory of battle, but the weight of mercy. The world had moved on, but the island remembered. Beneath the soil lay thousands still unaccounted for. Even into the 21st century, construction crews occasionally uncovered bones or rusted helmets, reminders that the ground itself held the record of what words could not fully convey. The limestone caves, once filled with fear and fire, had become shrines. Visitors walked through them in silence, guided by dim lights that revealed the scrawled handwriting of young soldiers on the walls, testaments of loyalty and farewell that had outlasted their authors. For historians, Okinawa remained both the final great battle of the Pacific and the first chapter of a new era, the moment when humanity stood between annihilation and compassion and chose, however briefly, to spare rather than destroy. The teenage soldiers who survived carried that choice within them for the rest of their lives. They became men in peace, but their youth had ended in that instant when they realized the enemy would not kill them. In their old age, when asked what they remembered most, they did not speak of battle or strategy. They spoke of the moment of water, of a Marine lowering his canteen toward them, of trembling hands accepting it, of sunlight falling through smoke. They spoke of confusion, of shame, of gratitude too complex for words. And when asked why they thought the Americans had spared them, they answered not with certainty, but with humility, perhaps because they saw that we were children. Okinawa's story did not end with surrender. It endured in every life that emerged from its ruins, in every act of rebuilding that followed, in every lesson passed from survivor to student. It was not a tale of heroism, nor of defeat, but of endurance, of the fragile thread that connects compassion and destruction. The teenage soldiers who could not believe they had been spared carried that thread with them until the end of their days. And in the quiet evenings of their final years, when the wind from the Pacific moved through the sugarcane fields once more, they would sometimes close their eyes and listen, not to the echo of war, but to the sound of the sea that had witnessed everything and forgotten nothing.